The courthouse in Riverside was unusually packed for a late summer morning. The air inside felt heavy, a strange mixture of anticipation, tension, and something else. Something palpable that hung in the space, making the room feel suffocating. The room was filled with faces, many familiar with the local judicial proceedings, some with cameras, ready to capture the next headline. Yet none of them knew that the moment that was about to unfold would alter more than just the life of one individual. It would challenge the very foundation of the justice system itself. In the middle of it all sat Judge Thomas Harding, his face as stoic as a mountain. At 62 years old, he had presided over hundreds, perhaps thousands, of cases. He was known for his no-nonsense approach, his ability to deliver swift justice with cold precision. But behind those eyes, despite the countless years of experience, there lingered an uncertainty, a small, unnoticed fissure in the usually unshakable demeanor. Perhaps it was just the weight of the decision he was about to make. This was a moment that would define his legacy, a decision that he knew would reverberate throughout his career and beyond. Today was no different, or so it seemed. Ryan Thomas, a 24-year-old mechanic, stood at the defense table, his body stiff, hands clenched into fists, the very picture of someone trying desperately to hold onto his sanity. His eyes, however, told a different story. Eyes filled with pain, disbelief, and above all, the quiet determination of a young man who knew his life was being stolen before his very eyes. Ryan's mother, seated in the back of the room, tried desperately to suppress the sobs that racked her body. Her gaze never left her son, but her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. This was her only child, the boy she had raised to be honest, hardworking, someone who dreamed of a better future, of becoming a firefighter, saving lives instead of having his own destroyed. She had sat in the courtroom day after day, watching her son be systematically dismantled by a system that she once believed was just, but now felt like it was nothing more than a series of gears working in the wrong direction. She had tried to fight for him, trying to show the jury that her son was not the man they painted him to be. But today, it felt like her voice had been lost among the noise, drowned out by the deafening weight of the evidence against him. Ryan had been accused of armed robbery. The robbery of a jewelry store in downtown Riverside that left one of the clerks, Samuel Gaines, fighting for his life after a gunshot wound. The prosecution's case seemed airtight: eyewitness testimony, grainy surveillance footage, and fingerprints on the weapon. There was no room for doubt in their eyes, not even the faintest glimmer. And yet, Ryan knew in his heart that he was innocent. He had not been there, he had not pulled that trigger, but that truth seemed to have no place in the courtroom. Judge Harding, who had witnessed his fair share of criminals and misfortunes, had grown accustomed to delivering the verdicts that sealed people's fates. His gavel was swift, and his judgments were always unshakable. Today, he stood at the cusp of yet another life-altering decision. His eyes scanned the room, briefly catching Ryan's gaze. For a fleeting moment, there was something in his eyes, something like doubt, or maybe it was just the weight of the trial. But he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted. His decision was final. It had to be. "Mr. Thomas," the judge began, his voice deep and resonant, reverberating off the walls of the courtroom. "You stand convicted of a crime that has left irreparable damage to this community. Your actions have been reckless, thoughtless, and above all, calculated. You've shown no remorse for what you've done." Ryan's body stiffened, and his mother gasped softly. He could feel his mother's gaze on him, the silent plea in her eyes, but it didn't matter. The verdict had been delivered. Judge Harding's words were like a slow, inevitable storm, thunderclaps of finality echoing through his very soul. I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison, effective immediately. The gavel struck with a resounding thud. The sound echoed in Ryan's mind, drowning out everything else. His world, once full of possibilities and hope, had now been reduced to nothing more than the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. The courtroom erupted into whispers, a ripple of shock and disbelief moving through the spectators. But Ryan didn't hear them. All he could hear were the steps of the bailiff approaching, the sound of shackles clicking as they were placed around his wrists. His legs felt heavy as he was led away from the defense table, his head held high despite the crushing weight of the world that had just fallen on him. He glanced once more at his mother. Her face was pale, tear-streaked, a picture of someone who had lost the fight before it had even begun. The doors to the courtroom closed behind him, sealing him away from the world he had known. For the first time, Ryan allowed himself to break. He couldn't hold back the tears anymore. Not for the crime he hadn't committed, but for the life that had been stolen from him. As he was led down the narrow hallways, the sound of his shackles clanging against the floor was all that remained. Judge Harding returned to his chambers, shutting the door against the noise, against the weight of his decision. He poured himself a cup of coffee, staring into the swirling black liquid as though it held the answers to questions he hadn't even known he had. The day had been long, exhausting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the fatigue. He had been on the bench for more than 35 years, and in that time he had handed down judgments with confidence. But today, there had been a shift, a feeling that gnawed at the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite place. As the night wore on, Harding dismissed the thought. He had done his job, and Ryan Thomas was guilty, wasn't he? The evidence had spoken for itself. And yet, in the quiet of his office, there was that nagging feeling, that small, unshakable doubt that refused to be silenced. The days following Ryan's sentencing felt strangely empty for Judge Harding. It wasn't a sense of guilt. He had seen far worse cases in his career. But there was something unsettling about Ryan's case that lingered in his thoughts, gnawing at him. For the first time in decades of presiding over cases, Harding found himself unable to fully embrace the sense of closure he had grown so accustomed to after delivering a final verdict. His nightly routine of reviewing case files felt different now. Every page he turned seemed to echo with the words that haunted him. Something was wrong, and he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He sat alone in his study one evening, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the papers scattered across his desk. The hum of the old air conditioning unit was the only sound in the room as Judge Harding sifted through a pile of legal briefs. Retirement had been on his mind more than usual lately. At 62, he had nothing left to prove. He had spent 35 years in the courtroom, shaping destinies with the swing of his gavel. His decisions were final, and in the world he had created, finality was everything. But tonight, the weight of Ryan's case clung to him like a shadow. The facts were irrefutable, or so they seemed. Eyewitnesses had sworn that Ryan was the man who committed the robbery. Surveillance footage showed a figure with the same build and posture as him. Fingerprints on the weapon confirmed the connection. The anonymous tip had sealed Ryan's fate. Yet, despite all of this, something about the case didn't sit right with Harding. It was then, as his eyes skimmed through the paperwork, that a forgotten detail caught his attention. A small, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence buried in the depths of a police log from a prior investigation. The name was a fleeting thing at first, Ryan Thomas. Harding froze, the pen he had been holding slipping from his fingers. He leaned forward in his chair, the sudden realization hitting him like a freight train. Ryan Thomas's name had appeared in an unrelated case file. Harding quickly flipped through the pages, his hands shaking as he reviewed the details. The log described a weapon, an unremarkable detail in a sea of cases, yet it stood out to Harding because of the timing. The gun had been seized during an investigation into a robbery that had taken place around the same time as the Carter's Jewelers incident. But the kicker was this: the weapon matched the description of the gun used in the robbery for which Ryan had been convicted. Harding's heart raced as he cross-referenced the serial number with his memory of the trial documents. It was an exact match, the same make, the same serial number, the same distinctive scratches on the barrel. But there was a problem. The report claimed that this particular gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. Harding's mind was spinning. If this gun had been in police custody, how could it have been the one used in the robbery? More importantly, if this wasn't the weapon used in the crime, whose fingerprints were on it? The feeling Harding had brushed aside earlier, the nagging discomfort, came rushing back with a vengeance. He knew he had to find answers, but he wasn't prepared for what he was about to uncover. Determined to dig deeper, Harding requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. The file arrived the next morning, a thick folder filled with photographs, police reports, and witness statements. He pored over it, his eyes scanning each document with growing unease. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was none other than Detective Andrew Lewis, the same detective who had testified in Ryan's trial. Harding felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen Lewis before, of course, an experienced officer with a reputation for getting results. But now the realization hit him. If Lewis had been involved in the unrelated case, what else had he been hiding? Harding's mind raced. How many other details had been buried, concealed, or manipulated in Ryan's trial? With his pulse quickening, Harding dove deeper into the files, hoping for some clue that could explain what had gone wrong. As he sifted through the paperwork, he found something else. A mention of the anonymous tip that had led to Ryan's arrest. Harding had paid little attention to it during the trial. It had seemed like nothing more than a stroke of luck for the police, but now it looked suspiciously engineered. The call had come from a burner phone, one registered under a name Harding recognized immediately, Detective Lewis. The implications were staggering. Harding had seen corrupt practices before, but never anything quite like this. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Ryan Thomas had been framed. The evidence had been manipulated. The witnesses had been coerced. Ryan's conviction was built on a foundation of lies. A knot formed in Harding's stomach as he processed this revelation. He had sentenced an innocent man, and now the truth was staring him in the face. What could he do? How far did the corruption go? And how could he expose it without bringing down the entire system he had spent his life upholding? The pressure mounted. Harding knew that revealing this information could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, and even his safety. He had spent decades in the courtroom, playing by the rules. But now the rules had betrayed him. The only thing left to do was to dig deeper, no matter the cost. The truth demanded it, and Harding would not let it slip away. The next morning, Harding met with his old friend, Daniel Hayes, a retired investigator known for his blunt approach to uncovering the truth. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the courthouse. Harding laid out his findings, explaining everything in detail as Hayes listened carefully, his face unreadable. "This isn't just negligence, Thomas," Hayes said, his voice low and steady. "If what you're saying is true, then someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall. And you're right to be worried. This isn't just a mistake. It's a conspiracy." Harding nodded, his mind reeling from the weight of Hayes's words. "I need proof. Solid proof. I can't just bring this to light without it." Hayes agreed to help, and over the following days, they worked together, combing through police records, witness statements, and internal memos. What they found was staggering. Falsified reports, missing evidence logs, testimonies that had been altered to fit the prosecution's narrative. The web of corruption stretched farther than Harding could have imagined. One witness, a store clerk who had initially identified another man as the suspect, had been coerced into changing his statement to implicate Ryan. Hayes tracked the man down, and when they confronted him, the truth came tumbling out. "I didn't want to do it," the clerk confessed, his hands trembling as he spoke. "But Detective Lewis," he pressured me, "said if I didn't, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I didn't have a choice." The clerk's words hit Harding like a punch to the gut. Detective Lewis, the same officer who had manipulated evidence, had also threatened witnesses into compliance. Harding knew now that Ryan's fate had been sealed by a man who was supposed to be upholding the law. As Hayes and Harding continued their investigation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Detective Lewis had a history of using questionable tactics to close cases, fabricating evidence, intimidating witnesses, and coercing confessions. But through it all, his record had remained spotless, protected by the bureaucratic machinery that surrounded him. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on Judge Harding as he sat in his study late into the night. The evidence was clear now. Ryan Thomas had been framed, manipulated by Detective Andrew Lewis and possibly others within the police force. The web of lies and corruption was vast, and Harding knew that uncovering the full extent of it could cost him everything. The career he had worked so hard to build, his reputation, and perhaps even his safety. But there was no turning back now. The truth had surfaced, and Harding couldn't bury it again. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. He met with Daniel Hayes again the following day, their meeting taking place in the same dimly lit diner where they had first begun their investigation. Harding knew that this decision, this moment, could define everything that followed. "I have to expose this," Harding said quietly, his voice low with determination. "The truth is out there, and if I don't act, then I'm complicit in a miscarriage of justice. I can't live with that." Hayes, a man who had spent decades uncovering corruption, nodded solemnly. "You're right, but it's not going to be easy. You're going up against the system itself. Lewis has powerful allies, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep this quiet. If you go public, you'll be a target. You need solid proof, Thomas, proof that's undeniable." With that, Harding and Hayes set to work. They knew that they had the pieces of the puzzle, but the final piece was elusive. They needed something concrete, something that could not be ignored by anyone, something that would force the hand of those in power. They searched through police files, witness statements, and old reports, looking for anything that could prove once, and for all that Detective Lewis was the mastermind behind Ryan's wrongful conviction. It was Hayes who found it, the missing link. Security footage from a parking lot near Carter's Jewelers, recorded on the day of the robbery, had somehow never been submitted as evidence in the trial. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show a man who looked remarkably like Detective Lewis leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Harding sat in his study, watching the footage over and over. Each time, the realization grew stronger. The man in the video was not just a random bystander. It was Lewis, the very detective who had led the investigation into Ryan's case. The pieces clicked into place. It wasn't just a robbery. It was orchestrated by Lewis himself, using Ryan as a scapegoat to cover his tracks. With this footage in hand, Harding knew they had their smoking gun. They had the proof they needed to expose the truth and bring down the corrupt officers who had manipulated Ryan's fate. But they also knew the risks. Going public with this evidence would set off a chain of events that would likely destroy their careers. Yet Harding could not look away from the truth. It was time to do what was right, no matter the cost. Harding filed an emergency motion to reopen Ryan Thomas's case, attaching the newly uncovered footage along with all the damning evidence they had gathered. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse. For the first time, the people who had supported the conviction began to question their own certainty. But the real storm would come when Harding went public with his findings. The next day, he filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Detective Lewis and the entire Fresno Police Department. The media, which had once lauded Harding for his tough, unyielding rulings, now turned their attention to him. The headlines screamed accusations of corruption, betrayal, and scandal. The courtroom, once a place where Harding had handed down final verdicts with authority, now felt like an arena for his own trial. Harding received the first anonymous threat shortly after his complaint went public. A slip of paper was left on his doorstep with a single message: "Drop it, or else." At first, Harding thought little of it, chalking it up to the usual intimidation tactics used by those with something to hide. But as the days passed, the threats escalated. His car tires were slashed one morning. The next, a crude note was taped to his front door. Harding knew that the stakes were rising, but there was no turning back. The truth had to come out. Meanwhile, Detective Lewis, now fully aware of the mounting evidence against him, began to lash out. Through his lawyer, Lewis denied all allegations, claiming that Harding's motion was nothing more than a personal vendetta against him. He appeared in interviews, his polished demeanor betraying no hint of guilt, as he claimed that Harding was simply trying to destroy his career. But Harding knew better. The evidence was irrefutable. Lewis's denial only deepened the pit of corruption that Harding had uncovered. The media coverage surrounding the case grew intense, and public opinion became divided. Some hailed Harding as a hero for exposing the truth, while others branded him a traitor to the system. The backlash was swift, and Harding's life was thrown into chaos. He received more threats, some subtle, others not so much. He was harassed at every turn, and his once quiet life had turned into a constant barrage of danger and scrutiny. Then, Hayes uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, a set of deleted emails from Detective Lewis's police account. The emails detailed a plan to ensure a conviction in the Carter's Jewelers case. Attached was a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements, all part of the conspiracy to frame Ryan Thomas. Harding's stomach churned as he read the emails, the words now confirming everything they had suspected. With the final piece of evidence in hand, Harding knew it was time to act. He called for an emergency hearing, where the newly discovered footage would be presented. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of Ryan's family. When the footage was shown, the reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The footage clearly showed Detective Lewis leaving the scene of the robbery, his face unmistakable. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sunk in. Harding, his voice steady but filled with resolve, addressed the court. "This man," he said, pointing to the image on the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Ryan Thomas. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was swift. Lewis, now pale and shaking, was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his defiant glare lingering in the air long after he was gone. For the first time in his life, Harding felt the weight of the truth lift from his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but for Ryan, the tide was turning. The following days saw the beginning of a long, difficult process. Ryan Thomas's conviction was overturned. The court ruled that the evidence against him had been tampered with, and he was released from prison, his name cleared after years of wrongful imprisonment. His mother, once silent with grief, rushed to embrace him as the courtroom erupted into applause. Ryan stood, thinner and visibly worn from the years spent behind bars, but he held his head high, a quiet strength emanating from him. For Harding, the victory was bittersweet. He had fought for justice, but the cost had been immense. His career, his reputation, and his safety had all been placed on the line. But the truth had prevailed, and that was what mattered most. As the days passed, Detective Lewis faced criminal charges for his role in framing Ryan. The scandal sent shockwaves through the Fresno Police Department, sparking investigations into systemic corruption within the force. The public demanded reform, and Harding's actions became a symbol of accountability and courage in the face of an unjust system. Ryan, now a free man, vowed to dedicate his life to helping those who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a beacon of hope for others who had been wronged by the system. For him, this was just the beginning. The truth had set him free, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure that others found the same freedom. For Judge Harding, the victory was only a small part of a much larger battle. The justice system was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. Harding had learned that the pursuit of truth wasn't always easy. Sometimes it came at a great cost. But he was prepared to spend the rest of his life fighting for a better, more just system. One that would never again let a man like Ryan Thomas fall through the cracks. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters,